The map came back wrong. That was how Sergeant Harriman put it in his incident log, clinically, precisely, in the understated language of a man who had watched SG teams step through a shimmering event horizon into gold torture chambers, ancient plague worlds, and at least one planet made entirely of treacle, and who had learned that, wrong, covered more ground than most people appreciated. The MALP from P3X774 had transmitted 47 seconds of footage before the signal died. 47 seconds was enough. General George Hammond had watched the recording 4 times in the 15 minutes since it came through, and each viewing left him with the same sensation, the particular cold weight that settled behind his sternum whenever the universe reminded him that humanity's grasp of what was out there remained, despite everything, embarrassingly incomplete. The footage showed a landscape. Rocky, arid, lit by a pale orange sun hanging low over a ridge of iron-colored stone. Standard enough. The Stargate stood intact in the foreground, its DHD undamaged, a thin haze of smoke drifting across the ground behind it. Then the camera had panned, the MALP's automated sweep protocol, 15 degrees every 8 seconds, and the landscape changed. A vessel had come down hard across the ridge. Not a Hawk. Not a gold design of any configuration Hammond recognized, and after 6 years commanding the SGC he recognized most of them. This ship was massive, angular, built from dark metal that caught the orange sunlight with a dull industrial sheen, its hull cracked open along a line that suggested catastrophic structural failure rather than weapons fire. Debris fields extended 300 meters in every direction. Fires still burned in the wreckage. Then the figures appeared. 2 of them, initially. Each standing. Hammond had asked Harriman to confirm the scale against the gate, approximately 9 meters tall. Bipedal. Mechanical. Moving with the fluid purposefulness of creatures that were not stumbling, not malfunctioning, not damaged beyond function, but fighting. One was predominantly blue and red, broad-shouldered, its movements carrying a quality that Hammond could only describe, somewhat absurdly, as deliberate. The other was silver-gray, low and predatory in its stance, wielding something that discharged a purple-white energy blast which struck the blue one across the chest and knocked it backward 20 feet into the gate structure hard enough to crack the stone plinth beneath the DHD. Then 3 more appeared from the wreckage. Then 2 more beyond them. Then the MALP took a direct hit from something that wasn't aimed at it specifically but didn't need to be, and the feed went dark. Hammond had looked at his 4-person flagship team across the briefing room table and said, with the precision of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything and started simply managing it. Thoughts? Jack O'Neill had said. Big robots. Daniel Jackson had reached for his coffee with the expression of a man mentally rearranging everything he thought he knew about the ancient gate builder's travel history. Samantha Carter had already opened her laptop. Tilk had watched the footage with the focused stillness of a warrior filing away tactical data, and said nothing, which was its own kind of assessment. 22 minutes later, SG-1 stepped through the gate to P3X774. The smoke was thicker in person. It carried the smell of burning metal and something else beneath it, an electrical charge, sharp and clean, like the air after a lightning strike, and it lay across the valley floor in slow-moving banks that caught the orange light and turned it amber. The gate plaza was intact but the ground surrounding it had been comprehensively destroyed. Carter's boots crunched over shattered rock and twisted debris as she swept her scanner in a slow arc, her expression cycling through the stages Hammond had learned to read as raw data arriving faster than analysis could process it. Energy signatures, she said. Multiple. Large. 2 distinct emission types, one here, bearing 270, approximately 400 meters. One beyond the ridge, moving. Moving toward us or away? O'Neill asked. Toward. O'Neill raised his P90 with the calm of a man who understood perfectly well that a P90 was not going to be the deciding factor in whatever was coming but raised it anyway because that was what you did. Tilk brought his staff weapon to a ready position. Daniel kept his hands visible and his sidearm holstered, which was either admirable diplomatic instinct or optimism, depending on your perspective. The thing that came over the ridge was the blue and red one from the footage. Up close, the scale was different. The Malp's camera had conveyed size. Standing 30 meters away on foot, with the shadow of it falling across all four of them simultaneously, O'Neill experienced size as a physical fact in a way that reconnaissance footage simply did not prepare you for. It moved carefully. That was the first thing that registered, the deliberateness of it, each step placed with a precision that suggested it was very aware of how much ground it displaced, and it stopped when it saw them. It looked down. A long pause followed. Then it spoke. The voice was deep, measured, carrying an authority that had nothing performative about it. Not the theatrical godhood of a Goa'uld, not the clinical detachment of an Asgard, but something that felt, improbably, like command earned rather than assumed. "I am Optimus Prime. I mean you no harm." O'Neill looked up at it for a long moment. Looked back at his team. Looked up again. "Jack O'Neill," he said. "SGC. We're going to need you to come with us. A beat. We have a bigger door than it looks." If you want to see more characters collide with the Stargate universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in the comments below. Indeed. The iris had never been the problem. The iris, 3-inch thick titanium trinium alloy, capable of stopping matter reintegration at the subatomic level, the SGC's first and most absolute line of defense against anything the Gate could deliver, had stopped Goa'uld shock troops, replicator probes, rogue NID operatives, and on one memorable occasion a very large and very confused UNAs that Tilk had declined to discuss in his official debrief. It had never been asked to stop something that didn't come through the Gate. The iris, as a defensive architecture, was predicated on the assumption that threats arrived via wormhole. It had no protocol for threats that arrived via wormhole, declined to fit through the Gate, and then stood in the gate room looking at the iris with an expression that, insofar as a 9-meter mechanical being could be said to have expressions, suggested polite patience. Optimus Prime had not, in the end, come through the Stargate. What had come through, in sequence, over the 40 minutes following first contact on P3X774, was Bumblebee, who was smaller than the others and had navigated the gate with something approaching ease, emerging in the SGC gate room in a combat crouch before slowly straightening and looking around with large optical sensors that somehow conveyed curiosity more than threat. Then Ironhide, who was broader, darker, and had to turn sideways and duck in a way that left scoring marks on both sides of the gate housing that the SGC's maintenance team would be documenting for weeks. Then Ratchet, who paused on the ramp long enough to scan the entire gate room with a sweeping sensor array before pronouncing the atmosphere breathable and the structural integrity of the facility adequate, in a tone that suggested adequate was a generous assessment. Optimus Prime himself had remained on P3X774. The Stargate's inner diameter was 6.7 meters. Optimus Prime was not 6.7 meters. This was a problem O'Neill described, upon his return through the gate, as geometry. Hammond had ordered an engineering assessment within the hour. What Hammond had in his base right now was 3 very large robots, 43 increasingly uncomfortable Marines, Sergeant Harriman doing his level best to continue operating his console with professional composure despite the fact that Bumblebee was standing directly behind him and appeared to be reading his screens, and a situation that no SGC regulation, standing order, or contingency protocol addressed with anything resembling specificity. He handled it the way he handled everything. He called a briefing. "What we know," Hammond said, standing at the head of the table while his 4-person flagship team arranged themselves in their usual seats, and the 3 Autobots occupied the back half of the room in a way that precluded the use of several chairs, 2 wall-mounted displays, and the coffee station, "is limited. What we need to know is considerably larger." Carter pulled up her preliminary analysis on the display. "The energy signatures I'm reading from our guests are unlike anything in our database. It's not Naquata-based, not 0 Point, not Asgard. There's a resonance pattern that has some superficial similarity to ancient power signatures, but the underlying physics are different. I'd need significantly more time to characterize it properly. She paused. What I can say is that the output levels are substantial. Each of them is putting out more raw energy than a fully charged Naquadah generator. Weapons capability? Hammond asked. Ironhide alone has shoulder-mounted cannons that I'd estimate at somewhere above a staff weapon and below a Hotak main battery. In a confined space like this facility. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Hammond turned to where Optimus Prime's voice was being relayed via the communication link SG-1 had established on P3X774. The Autobot leader had accepted the arrangement without apparent offense, which said something about either his patience or his tactical assessment of the situation. Prime. I need to understand what happened to your ship and where the rest of your people are. The relay carried a brief pause before the response. Our vessel suffered critical damage during transition through your gate network. We did not initiate travel to this location. Our navigation system locked onto a coordinate signal embedded in an ancient database we recovered on a world called Velocitron, 3 star systems from your gate's origin point. The signal led here. The transit destroyed our ship. Another pause waited. The Decepticons who were aboard survived the crash as we did. They did not remain on the planet. The silence in the briefing room had a specific quality to it. How many Decepticons? O'Neill asked. Megatron. Starscream. Soundwave. Shockwave. An assault contingent of approximately 20. The relay carried something that might have been controlled tension in a human voice. Megatron will not waste time. He will assess this galaxy's power structures immediately and identify the fastest route to dominance. Whatever resources your enemies possess, technology, territory, military force, he will attempt to acquire or destroy them within hours of making contact. Daniel had his notepad out. You said an ancient database. The signal that brought you here, do you have any idea what it was actually pointing to? Why the ancients would have encoded Cybertronian coordinates? No, Optimus Prime said. But I have suspected, for some time, that the answer to that question is more significant than anything else currently on this table. Hammond looked at his team. O'Neill was already wearing the expression he wore when the situation had moved past complicated into the territory he privately categorized as another Tuesday. Tilk was watching the 3 Autobots with the focused assessment of a warrior recalibrating threat matrices. Carter was running numbers. Daniel was already 3 steps ahead of the evidence. All right, Hammond said. We figure out where Megatron went. We figure out what he found. And we do it before whatever he's planning becomes something we can't stop. He looked toward the relay. Prime, we're going to need your full cooperation. General Hammond, Optimus Prime said. You already have it. Megatron had not survived 10 million years of war by misreading power. He had learned, across those millennia of conquest and survival, that every civilization organized itself around the same fundamental architecture, resources, weapons, hierarchy, and the will to use all 3 without hesitation. The specifics changed. The underlying grammar did not. Cybertron had its energon. Earth had its oil. Every galaxy, it seemed, had its currency of destruction, and the only question that ever mattered upon arrival in unfamiliar territory was, who holds it, who wants it, and who is weak enough to be relieved of it? He had spent 4 hours moving through the gate network. The stolen DHD had given him access. Starscream, to his marginal credit, had acquired it from the crash site before Optimus Prime's insufferable diplomatic instincts had led him toward the biological creatures with their primitive projectile weapons. 4 hours of systematic dialing, soundwave monitoring gate traffic frequencies, shockwave analyzing the Naquadah residue signatures on each world they transited, had built a picture. This galaxy was at war. Multiple factions, overlapping territorial claims, a species called humans at the center of a conflict they were dramatically under-equipped to survive, and above all of it, a power structure built on slavery, false divinity, and the systematic suppression of technological development among subjugated populations. It was, Megatron reflected, almost familiar. The world they had settled on was called P2X338 in the humans' cataloging system. The Gold called it Selkit's Reach, a secondary Naquata processing facility operating under the authority of a minor system lord whose name Soundwave had extracted from intercepted communications within the first 40 minutes. The facility's Jaffa garrison numbered 300. The processing operation ran continuously. The Naquata output fed directly into a larger supply chain that Shockwave had traced, with his customary methodical precision, toward a fleet signature that didn't match any of the system lord configurations in the intercepted data, something larger, more sophisticated, operating at the edges of the network with the deliberateness of a predator that didn't need to announce itself. That signature interested Megatron considerably. He had not attacked the facility. He had watched it. This was a distinction that Starscream, characteristically, had failed to appreciate. "We have sufficient firepower to level this installation in under 4 minutes," Starscream had observed, from his perched position on a ridge overlooking the processing complex. "The Naquata stores alone would sustain our operations for how long?" Megatron had asked, without turning. Starscream had done the calculation. The silence that followed was answer enough. "Weeks," Megatron said. "Perhaps months if Shockwave's conversion estimates are accurate. And then we are in the same position, on a world whose garrison we have destroyed, broadcasting our location to every military force in this galaxy simultaneously." He had turned then, fixing Starscream with the look that had ended more arguments than weapons fire ever had. "We are not here to raid. We are here to conquer. There is a difference, and you will internalize it before you speak again." The fleet signature had resolved, by the following morning, into something extraordinary. The ships were Hatak class, pyramid-shaped, Naquata-hulled, the standard capital vessel of Gold military power, but modified. Enhanced. The weapon emplacements were not standard configuration, and the energy readings Soundwave was pulling from their drives suggested a power source that had been augmented beyond factory specification in ways that implied access to technology outside the normal Gold development curve. 14 vessels, moving in a formation that suggested centralized command rather than the fractious independence typical of system lord fleets. And at the center of the formation, one vessel larger than the rest, running an energy signature that made Soundwave's sensor array produce a tone none of them had heard before. "That reading," Shockwave said, his single optical sensor narrowing as he processed the data. "It is partially consistent with the ancient signal that brought us to this galaxy. Degraded. Filtered through different technology. But the underlying resonance pattern is the same." Megatron had looked at the fleet for a long time. "Find me a way to communicate with whoever commands those ships," he said. "Without the humans knowing." It had taken Soundwave 6 hours. It had taken the entity that identified itself as Anubis approximately 30 seconds to respond. The communication was text-based. Soundwave had established a signal pathway through a relay on a dead moon, untraceable, using a frequency outside the SGC's monitoring range. What came back was not the florid self-aggrandizement Megatron had expected from the intercepted Gold communications. It was precise. Economical. It asked 3 questions in sequence. What are you, what do you want, and what can you offer that I cannot take by force? Megatron had found, against his better instincts, something approaching respect. His response had been equally direct. They were Decepticons, a mechanical civilization of warriors whose technology operated on principles this galaxy had not yet developed. What he wanted was Naquata in quantity sufficient to sustain extended operations, gate access across the full network, and autonomy of action within agreed territorial boundaries. What he could offer was a force multiplier that no Gold army, no Asgard fleet, and no collection of human soldiers with their pitiful projectile weapons could match in open combat. 20 Decepticons, fully operational, with no biological vulnerabilities, no need for breathable atmosphere, no fatigue, and a collective weapons payload that could reduce a hot act to debris in under 2 minutes. Anubis had replied with coordinates and a time. The meeting was in 12 hours. Megatron had spent those hours running scenarios, because he was not, whatever Starscream's operational assessments suggested, a creature of impulse. He understood exactly what Anubis was. He understood that any agreement with a being of that nature was a temporary arrangement at best and a trap at worst. He understood that the ancient resonance in Anubis's power signature meant the half-ascended system lord wanted something from the Decepticons beyond military utility. He was going anyway. Because the entity that didn't take the meeting lost the initiative, and Megatron had not survived 10 million years by letting someone else set the board. The planet Anubis had a reputation. Among the Jaffa it was spoken of in the particular register reserved for places where the false gods demonstrated what happened to those who forgot their place in the divine order, a Naquata mining operation running on the labor of prisoners. Goa'uld-condemned warriors and their families worked to death in pit conditions that made standard Jaffa service look comfortable by comparison. SG-1 had known about Anubis for 18 months. They had not been able to do anything about it for 18 months. Because the Goa'uld garrison numbered in the thousands, the orbital defense net made insertion a one-way trip, and Hammond had not yet found a tactical approach that didn't end with his flagship team dead on a prison world before breakfast. The tactical approach had now found them. The intelligence had come from Tilk, cross-referenced against Autobot sensor data that Ironhide had pulled from a Decepticon communication intercept soundwave had carelessly broadcast on a frequency Ratchet recognized as adjacent to Cybertronian military Band 7. The Decepticons had been on Anubis for at least 30 hours. They were not mining Naquata themselves. That was still Jaffa and prisoner labor. But they were overseeing the installation of something in the processing facility's lower levels, something that Shockwave's engineering signature was all over according to Ratchet's analysis, and whatever it was drew enough power from the facility's Naquata reactors to reduce the orbital defense net to 60% capacity while it ran. 60% capacity was not comfortable. It was, however, no longer a one-way trip. "I want to be clear," O'Neill said, standing in the P3X774 gate plaza where the mission brief was happening because the SGC gate room still had 3 Autobots in it, and Hammond had decided that conducting operational planning in a room where Bumblebee kept reading Harriman's screens was suboptimal. "That our objective is the prisoners. The mining operation. We get the people out. Everything else is secondary. The conversion device Shockwave is installing," Ratchet said. He was crouched at the edge of the plaza, which brought his optical sensors to approximately O'Neill's eye level and made the conversation feel almost normal if you didn't think about it too hard. "If it completes its calibration cycle, it will begin processing Naquata into a compound that functions as a crude energon analog. Crude, but sufficient. Megatron will have a resupply chain operating inside the Goa'uld's own industrial infrastructure. Which means he won't need to raid for resources," Carter said. "He can sustain indefinite operations anywhere the gate network reaches. So we're also destroying the device," O'Neill said. This was not a question. "Simultaneously with the prisoner extraction," Tilk confirmed, in the tone he used when he had already planned both and was simply waiting for the conversation to reach the conclusion he'd arrived at 20 minutes earlier. The team going through was SG-1 plus Ironhide and Bumblebee. Ratchet stayed on P3X774 as extraction support. His medical systems were the closest thing the mission had to a field hospital, and someone needed to be functional at the gate end when they came back. Ironhide had argued briefly for a larger Autobot contingent, in the way that someone argues when they know the argument is correct but the logistics don't support it, and had accepted the outcome with the professional resignation of a soldier who had been overruled by operational reality enough times to recognize when it was happening again. Anubis from the ground was worse than the intelligence reports. The pit was deeper than the aerial reconnaissance suggested. Goa'uld architects had a preference for making suffering visible from as many angles as possible, and the mine's terrace structure meant that a guard standing at any level could observe the labor on every level below. The smell of Naquata dust and inadequate sanitation and the specific exhaustion of people who had stopped expecting rescue hit them within 30 seconds of emerging from the service tunnel Tilk had identified from memory. The prisoners were Jaffa, mostly, warriors condemned for perceived disloyalty, their symbiotes removed before sentence, their bodies failing without the immune enhancement they'd carried since childhood, but there were humans too. Takare operatives. 2 people in SGC issue clothing that made O'Neill's jaw tighten in a way that meant someone was getting a name run the moment they had gate access. The garrison response came at the 4-minute mark. It came hard, death gliders from the orbital platforms, 6 of them, dropping altitude in the tight spiral that meant the pilots had a targeting solution and weren't being cautious about it. And it came simultaneously with the ground garrison mobilizing from the eastern compound in a formation that suggested someone had anticipated an insertion attempt and prepositioned accordingly. O'Neill registered both threats in the same second and made the tactical calculation that the ground formation was the immediate problem and the death gliders were Ironhide's problem, and communicated this with the economy of language that came from 6 years of working with people who understood him. Ironhide's response to being designated air cover was to bring both shoulder cannons online simultaneously, and put the first death glider into the second before either pilot completed their attack run. The sound was extraordinary. Not the sharp crack of a staff weapon or the percussive thud of an explosion, something deeper, more physical, a concussive discharge that Bumblebee's battle mask snapped shut against reflexively, and that Carter felt in her back teeth from 40 meters away. The second and third gliders broke formation. Ironhide tracked the brake and fired again, and the third glider came apart in a cascade of debris that rained across the pit's upper terraces in burning fragments. Bumblebee had gone directly into the ground formation. He moved fast, faster than something his size had any right to move. And he moved smart, threading between the Jaffa ranks in a way that created maximum disruption with minimum lethal engagement, his stingers set to a non-lethal discharge level that Ratchet had calibrated before departure, and that Bumblebee was applying with a precision that suggested he had thought carefully about the difference between soldiers following orders and enemies choosing war. Staff weapon blasts hit his armor and scored it without penetrating. He didn't stop moving. Tilk and O'Neill took the opening Bumblebee created and moved through the formation with the coordinated efficiency of warriors who had been fighting beside each other long enough that communication had become largely unnecessary. Carter had the processing facility's lower level on her scanner, and was moving toward Shockwave's device with Daniel covering her 6, and both of them understanding that they had whatever time Ironhide could buy them, and not a second more. The device was larger than the schematics had suggested. It filled the lower chamber with the hum of a calibration cycle that was, according to Carter's scanner, 14 minutes from completion. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds before determining that she didn't have 14 minutes, didn't have the tools for a clean extraction, and didn't need them. She set the C4 for 90 seconds and pulled Daniel back toward the stairs. Above them, Ironhide put the last death glider into the ridge wall with a shot that lit the entire pit like a second sunrise, and the prisoners, who had been watching the battle with the stunned expression of people recalibrating the boundaries of what rescue could look like, began to move. It was not, strictly speaking, a scientific method in the sense that Sam Carter would have recognized. She built hypotheses from data points, tested them against measurable outcomes, and revised her models with the systematic discipline of someone who had learned early that the universe did not accommodate wishful thinking. Daniel's method was different. It started with a feeling. Not intuition exactly, and not guesswork. Something more like pattern recognition operating below the threshold of conscious analysis, a low-level hum of connection between things that didn't obviously belong together, which had led him across 15 years of academic ridicule and 6 years of gate travel to more genuinely transformative discoveries than he could count, and several he wished he couldn't. The feeling had started on Anubis, during the extraction, when Bumblebee had taken a sustained staff weapon burst across his left shoulder, and the armor had cracked along a seam, exposing the substructure beneath. Daniel had seen it for less than 2 seconds before Bumblebee's self-repair systems began closing the gap. Not enough time to analyze, barely enough time to register. but something in the geometric arrangement of the exposed components had snagged on something in his memory the way a specific word in an unfamiliar language sometimes snagged when you'd seen its root form in a text you'd studied years before. He'd spent the entire transit back to P3X774 staring at Bumblebee's shoulder. Bumblebee had noticed, and had responded with the particular communicative chirp and whistle language he used when his vocoder was damaged, a sequence that Ratchet, upon their return, translated with the weary precision of someone who had been doing this for longer than human civilization had existed as, "He wants to know why you keep looking at me like I'm a fossil." "Because," Daniel had said, "I think you might be." That had been 36 hours ago. He was still working. The SGC's archaeology lab had been reorganized to accommodate a situation its designers had not anticipated, specifically, the presence of Optimus Prime, who had been brought through the SGC's vehicle bay entrance via a sequence of structural modifications that Hammond had authorized with the expression of a man adding a line item to an already incomprehensible budget, and who was now seated. Insofar as a 9-meter robot could be said to be seated against the lab's reinforced back wall, while Daniel covered every available surface with photographs, rubbings, digital scans, and 3 separate printouts of the ancient database section that SG-1 had downloaded from the Antarctica outpost 2 years earlier and never fully translated. Carter was there. She had come in 4 hours ago for what she described as a 5-minute check-in and had not left. "Run it again," Daniel said. Carter pulled up the comparative analysis on the wall display. On the left, a section of the ancient database, specifically the portion cataloging what the database's own index described as early experimentation in the transfer of consciousness to non-biological substrate, a section that every previous analysis team had filed under theoretical and moved past, because the ancients had experimented with approximately everything and the database was 11 million years old, and you couldn't follow every thread. On the right, a high-resolution scan of the geometric script running along Optimus Prime's chassis, captured during his medical assessment by Ratchet 2 days earlier. The overlap was not perfect. It was not even close to perfect. But it was not nothing. "The root morphemes," Daniel said, pointing. "Here, here, and here. The ancient script uses a logographic base with phonetic complements. We've established that. What we haven't established is why approximately 30% of the logographic base has no identified etymological origin in any ancient text we've catalogued. It doesn't derive from the Alteran language. It doesn't derive from any known proto-ancient form." He turned to Optimus Prime. "The script on your chassis. Your people's written language. How old is it?" Optimus Prime was quiet for a moment. "The oldest Cybertronian records place the origin of our written language at approximately 12 million years before present. Before that," another pause, weighted differently than his usual careful consideration. "Before that, there is nothing. Our historical record does not extend further. We have always understood this as a limitation of early data preservation. The records were lost. Or they were never yours to begin with," Daniel said. Carter looked up from her laptop. "The ancients left Earth approximately 5 million years ago," Daniel continued, moving to the display and pulling up a timeline he'd constructed overnight. "But they'd been traveling the gate network for millions of years before that. Seeding stargates. Visiting worlds. The database mentions, briefly, in a section we've always interpreted as metaphorical, a project they called Primus Machina. Direct translation, first machine. We assumed it referred to the Stargate network itself. The gates are machines." It was a reasonable interpretation. He pulled up the translation alongside the Cybertronian script comparison. "It wasn't the gate network," he said. "Primus Machina was a separate project. The creation of a self-sustaining, self-replicating, self-aware mechanical civilization, seated on a world the database designates by coordinates that," he pulled up the final overlay, "match Cybertron's stellar position to within acceptable astronomical drift for 12 million years of galactic rotation." The silence in the lab had the particular density of silence that follows a statement too large to immediately process. Carter said quietly. The ancients built the transformers. The ancients created the conditions for Cybertronian life. Daniel corrected, with the precision of someone who understood that the distinction mattered enormously. The same way they seeded human life on thousands of worlds. They didn't build you, he said to Optimus Prime. They started you. 12 million years ago, on a world they designated as an experiment in non-biological consciousness, they planted the foundational architecture of what would become your civilization and then left, Optimus Prime said. Left, Daniel confirmed. The way they always did. Optimus Prime was still for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried something Daniel had not heard in it before. Not the measured command authority of a military leader, not the careful diplomacy of a first contact situation, but something older and quieter, the tone of a being confronting the possibility that the foundation of everything he understood about his own existence had just shifted by 12 million years. The signal, he said. The one that brought us here. It wasn't a navigation beacon. No, Daniel said. It was a recall. Daniel looked at him steadily. That's my working theory, yes. Carter had stopped typing. Optimus Prime's optical sensors moved slowly across the wall of evidence. The ancient text, the Cybertronian script, the timeline, the coordinate overlay. And Daniel watched him process it with the patience of someone who understood that some discoveries needed to be inhabited before they could be acted upon. If this is accurate, Optimus Prime said finally, then Anubis knows. His ancient knowledge, if it extends to this project, he would recognize what we are the moment he encountered us. Which means he didn't just agree to meet Megatron because he wanted soldiers, Carter said. He wants to know how to reverse engineer a spark, Optimus Prime said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The life force at the core of every Cybertronian. If the ancients designed it, there is an ancient framework for replicating it. And if Anubis can replicate it, he can build his own army, O'Neill said from the doorway, where he had apparently been standing long enough to catch the relevant portion, holding a coffee mug and wearing the expression of a man who had hoped, against mounting evidence, that today's crisis would be merely galactic in scale rather than existential. Not just an army, Carter said. Mechanical soldiers with no biological vulnerabilities, no symbiote dependency, no Tredonin requirement. Immune to every weapon system currently deployed by every faction in this galaxy. O'Neill looked at his coffee. I'm going to need Hammond. Anubis did not think in the register of urgency. Urgency was a biological condition, the product of cortisol, of heartbeats, of the fundamental animal awareness that time was finite and the body that carried you through it was fragile. Anubis had burned through that limitation the way he had burned through most limitations, systematically, without sentiment, leaving nothing useful behind. What remained of him operated on a different timescale, one calibrated to the slow grinding logic of civilizational dominance rather than the tactical immediacy that preoccupied lesser system lords. Ball schemed in seasons. You thought in decades. Anubis planned in centuries, and the patience that came with that perspective had allowed him to survive things that had destroyed every other power in the galaxy that had tried to contain him. The Decepticons were interesting precisely because they did not fit his existing models. He had reviewed Soundwave's intercepted communications, obtained not through any Decepticon carelessness but through a gold intelligence asset embedded in the frequency monitoring station on Selkit's Reach, a redundancy Anubis maintained on every significant communication node in his sphere of influence. And the picture they assembled was consistent with what his ancient knowledge had suggested the moment the Cybertronian vessel's energy signature had resolved on his fleet's sensors. Primus Machina. The first machine project. He had found the reference in the Antarctic Outposts database 3 years ago, during the period of accelerated knowledge acquisition that had made him the most dangerous entity in the Milky Way, and he had filed it as a long-term strategic interest rather than an immediate operational priority. Because the coordinates pointed to a galaxy too distant for practical exploitation with the resources then available to him. The resources available to him had just changed. Megatron arrived at the designated coordinates with Starscream and Soundwave, a delegation small enough to suggest confidence rather than vulnerability, which Anubis noted as the choice of a tactician rather than a warlord. The meeting took place in deep space, equidistant between Anubis's fleet and the last confirmed Decepticon position, aboard a Hotak that Anubis had emptied of Jaffa for the occasion. The gesture was not courtesy. It was a controlled environment, instrumented beyond what any sensor suite Megatron carried would be able to detect, and every cubic meter of it was under continuous analysis. Megatron walked through the vessel's ring transporter chamber and looked around with the unhurried assessment of a being that had attended a great many meetings in a great many venues and had survived all of them. "You're not a Gold," he said. "I am beyond such definitions," Anubis replied, his voice carrying the harmonic distortion of the ancient-derived vocal modulation he used for effect as much as communication. His form was partially obscured by the energy field that substituted for a physical body, the half-ascended condition that the others had imposed, trapping him between planes of existence in a punishment that he had spent years converting from limitation to advantage. "You're partially ascended," Megatron said. "Your energy signature carries the same resonance as the signal that brought us to this galaxy. The ancients left something in you." Anubis was quiet for precisely long enough to convey that the observation was accurate, and that he was choosing to acknowledge it. "And they left something in you," he said. "In all of your kind. The question I find most interesting is whether either of us fully understands what." The negotiation that followed was conducted with a mutual directness that would have been unrecognizable to anyone familiar with standard Gold diplomatic practice, which ran on layers of implication, theatrical display, and the constant performance of divinity. Anubis offered Naquata supply through 3 mining operations in his controlled territory, unrestricted gate access across his network, and non-interference with Decepticon operations in sectors outside his immediate strategic interest. In exchange, he wanted 2 things: Decepticon military support in an upcoming campaign against the remaining system lords, and access to 1 Autobot subject for study. "Alive," he specified. "Intact. The spark undamaged." Megatron had looked at him for a long moment. "You want to replicate it. I want to understand it," Anubis said. "Understanding and replication are sequential steps, not simultaneous ones. And if I decline the second condition? Then we have a straightforward military arrangement, and I find another path to the same destination," Anubis said. "I am patient, Megatron. I have been patient for a very long time. But I find that patience is considerably more productive when augmented by cooperation." Megatron had agreed to the military arrangement without comment on the second condition, which Anubis interpreted correctly as neither acceptance nor refusal but a deferral, the response of a being that intended to make the decision on its own timeline rather than the one being offered. It was, Anubis reflected as Megatron's delegation departed through the ring transporter, exactly what he would have done. He gave the order to begin the Bumblebee acquisition operation 6 hours later. The intelligence had come from Soundwave's monitoring of SGC gate traffic. Bumblebee's energy signature was distinct and trackable across gate transit, and a mission debrief communication intercepted from the P3X774 relay indicated that the smallest Autobot was scheduled for an off-world assessment mission to a planet designated P4X221. A low-threat botanical survey world chosen specifically because its benign profile made it a suitable environment for testing Autobot gate travel acclimatization. Low threat was a designation that assumed the threat profile remained stable. Anubis dispatched 6 Hotak vessels and a ground force of 300 co-warriors, the drone soldiers he had developed using ancient knowledge, immune to conventional weapons, driven by artificially created symbiotes rather than willing hosts, with instructions that were precise to the point of being uncharacteristic for a Gold operation: no energy weapons discharged at the primary target. Capture only. The spark must be intact. SG-1 came through the gate to P4X221 with Bumblebee and Ratchet at 0600 hours SGC time, and found the Botanical Survey world exactly as advertised: peaceful, green, the gate plaza surrounded by vegetation so aggressively pleasant that O'Neill had made a comment about it before the map sweep was complete. The Hatak fleet dropped out of hyperspace 40 minutes later. The Cull Warriors began their ring transporter descent 90 seconds after that, hitting the surface at 6 insertion points simultaneously in a pattern designed to compress the target zone toward the gate, while cutting off retreat. O'Neill had his P-90 up before the first ring platform had finished cycling. Carter's scanner was already reading the energy signatures. Ratchet had placed himself between the incoming assault vectors and Bumblebee with the body language of a field medic who had made a decision about acceptable personal risk and was not revisiting it. Bumblebee looked at the descending Cull Warriors, at the sheer number of them, at their advance with the relentless mechanical consistency of soldiers that felt no hesitation and processed no fear. And then looked at the Hatak fleet hanging in the sky above the planet like a ceiling of malice, and made a sound through his damaged vocoder that Ratchet translated later, in his mission report, with the clinical accuracy of long familiarity. He said, "This feels personal." "It is," Ratchet said grimly, bringing his own weapons online. O'Neill fired the first shot at the lead Cull Warrior, watched it absorb the burst without slowing, and reached the same conclusion he always reached when conventional weapons bounced off the enemy. They were going to need a different approach. They were going to need it fast, and whatever it was going to hurt. Starscream had a philosophy. It was not a sophisticated philosophy. He would have been the first to acknowledge this, in the hypothetical scenario where acknowledging limitations was something he was capable of, which it wasn't, but it was a functional one, road-tested across millions of years of navigating the gap between his actual position in the Decepticon hierarchy and the position he believed he deserved. The philosophy ran as follows. Every alliance was temporary, every superior was eventually replaceable, and the optimal moment to accelerate a superior's replacement was precisely when that superior was most committed to a course of action they had not fully thought through. Megatron's arrangement with Anubis qualified on every count. The problem with Anubis, and Starscream had identified this problem within approximately 40 minutes of reviewing Soundwave's intelligence on the half-ascended System Lord, was not his power, which was considerable, or his intelligence, which was genuinely impressive by the standards of biological life, or even his ancient knowledge, which posed risks that Starscream preferred not to examine too closely. The problem with Anubis was that he was the kind of ally who planned to own everything he touched, and Megatron, in his characteristic pattern of underestimating opponents who matched his own ruthlessness, had walked into an arrangement that served Anubis's long-term objectives considerably more than it served the Decepticons. The Autobot capture operation was the clearest evidence. Megatron had agreed to non-interference. He had not agreed to active support. The distinction was Starscream's opening. The Takare had been surprisingly easy to locate. Their tunnel networks shifted, their bases relocated on irregular cycles, and their communication encryption was legitimately sophisticated. But Soundwave had been intercepting encoded transmissions since before the Takare resistance existed, and the underlying signal architecture they used was recognizable to anyone with sufficient baseline data. Starscream had found their current primary base within 18 hours of deciding to look, and had established a communication channel through a relay on a dead moon that he had not told Soundwave about, using a secondary transmitter he had not told Megatron about, because the entire point of the exercise was that Megatron didn't know. The Takare contact had identified herself as Anise. She had been, predictably, suspicious. "You are a Decepticon," she had said through the encrypted channel. "Your faction is in active military arrangement with Anubis. Why would we trust anything you transmit?" "You wouldn't," Starscream had said. "And I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to act on accurate intelligence that serves your operational interests, which is a different thing entirely. The Takare are pragmatists. So am I. Anubis has an Aquata depot at these coordinates." He had transmitted the location data. Currently storing 60% of his operational fuel reserve for the campaign he's planning against the remaining System Lords. He is moving that reserve in 72 hours. If you want to destroy it, you have a window. What you do with that information is your concern. He had transmitted the coordinates of P7X554, Anubis's primary Aquata depot, which he knew because Soundwave knew everything, and Soundwave reported to Megatron, and Megatron had shared operational details with his senior officers in the assumption that they were aligned, and then added the gate address for P4X221, where the Bumblebee acquisition operation was currently running. There is also an active Cull Warrior assault on this world, he had said. If the SGC's allies were to receive that information, Anubis's acquisition operation would be interrupted. The asset he is attempting to capture would remain outside his control. This delays his research program by an indeterminate but significant period. A pause, calibrated for effect. I have no interest in Anubis becoming the most powerful entity in this galaxy. I suspect you share that interest. He had closed the channel before Anise could respond, because the Takari were going to do exactly what he needed them to do regardless of whether they trusted him, because the intelligence was accurate, and the operational benefit was real, and the Takari had not survived as a resistance movement by ignoring actionable data out of principle. The result was that P7X554 received a Takari strike team 6 hours later. And P4X221, where O'Neill and SG-1 and 2 Autobots were being compressed toward the gate by 300 Cull Warriors while 6 Hatak vessels maintained orbital superiority, received something considerably more chaotic. The Takari Teltak came through the planet's upper atmosphere at an angle that suggested the pilot had made a targeting calculation and then decided the calculation was too conservative. A steep, fast descent that pulled 3 of the 6 Hatak vessels' attention upward and created, for approximately 90 seconds, a degradation in the orbital fire support covering the northern insertion vector. Carter saw it on her scanner before she heard the ship. Northern approach, gap in the coverage 60 seconds, maybe 90. Irehide, O'Neill said into the communicator. Irehide had been holding the ridge line on the northern approach since the assault began, absorbing weapons fire that would have vaporized a Jaffa position in the first exchange and returning it with the methodical efficiency of a warrior who had been doing this for longer than the Gold had existed as a species. He heard the word and understood it with the immediacy of a soldier who didn't need the sentence finished. He came off the ridge line at full acceleration and hit the Cull formation from the north at the precise moment the orbital coverage degraded, and the effect was the tactical equivalent of removing the keystone from an arch. The carefully coordinated compression assault lost its geometry in the space of 4 seconds. The insertion vectors that had been converging on the gate plaza suddenly had a 9-meter Autobot moving through them at speed, and the Cull Warriors, who were excellent at executing a predetermined assault plan and considerably less excellent at adapting to variables their programming hadn't anticipated, began to reconfigure in ways that created gaps. SG-1 moved through the gaps with the economy of a team that had been reading each other in combat for 6 years. Bumblebee reached the gate and dialed. Ratchet pushed through first with the 2 wounded SG team members he'd been carrying since the 3rd minute of the engagement. Carter went through calling back scanner readings. Daniel went through. Tilk went through last on the SGC's side, staff weapon firing continuously until the event horizon took him. O'Neill was at the DHD, Irehide covering him, when the Takari Teltak took a direct hit from one of the Hatak vessels and came apart in the upper atmosphere in a cascade of debris that lit the sky orange. O'Neill hit the final symbol and went through. Irehide looked at the sky, at the descending Cull Warriors, at the gate behind him, and made the calculation that every soldier makes when the extraction window is closing, fast, without the luxury of deliberation, and stepped backward through the event horizon as the first Cull energy blast hit the gate structure hard enough to crack the DHD housing. The wormhole disengaged. P4X221 went quiet, except for the sound of debris from the Takari Teltak still raining down through the upper atmosphere, and 300 Cull Warriors standing in a botanical survey world with no target and no further orders, waiting for instruction that wasn't coming because the operation had failed in Anubis, for the first time in a carefully constructed campaign, had not gotten what he came for. In his fleet above the planet, The half-ascended system lord considered this outcome for a long moment. Then he considered Starscream's absence from the Decepticon communication logs for the preceding 24 hours. Then he began to revise his operational timeline, because patience was productive, but so was acceleration, and the variables had just shifted in ways that made waiting less advantageous than it had been yesterday. The Naquadah to Energon conversion formula had started as a theoretical exercise. Carter had framed it that way in her initial research proposal to Hammond: theoretical, preliminary, exploratory, because she had learned over 6 years that proposals framed as theoretical received faster approval than proposals framed as urgent operational necessities, paradoxically, because theoretical didn't require Hammond to brief the Pentagon before signing off. The reality was that it was urgent and operational and a necessity, because Ratchet had run her the Autobot energy consumption numbers on their third day at the SGC, and the picture they painted was unambiguous. At current consumption rates, with zero energon resupply available in this galaxy, the Autobots had approximately 3 weeks of full operational capacity before degradation began, 6 weeks before combat effectiveness dropped below 50%, and 10 weeks before they became effectively inert. 10 weeks was not a long timeline against the threat profile they were currently managing. The breakthrough had come on day 5, during a 16-hour session in the SGC's modified lab, where Carter and Ratchet had established a working dynamic that functioned somewhere between peer collaboration and productive argument. Ratchet knew energon chemistry at a molecular level that no biological scientist could match. He had been working with the compound for millions of years. But he had no frame of reference for Naquadah's specific crystalline structure or the unusual quantum properties that made it simultaneously the most energy-dense naturally occurring material in the Milky Way and the most temperamental to process. Carter knew Naquadah deeply and Energon not at all, which meant they each held half of the solution, and the work was the process of building the bridge between them. The conversion process they developed was inefficient by Cybertronian standards, approximately 40% yield loss compared to raw energon, but it was functional, it was reproducible, and the Naquadah required was available through SGC supply chains in quantities sufficient to sustain Autobot operations indefinitely. Carter had documented the formula across 11 pages of technical notation, stored it in the SGC's secure server, and transmitted a compressed version to Ratchet's internal database as primary backup. Soundwave had intercepted the transmission within 40 seconds of its broadcast. The interception was not a failure of SGC encryption. The SGC's encryption was, by the standards of human technology in the early 21st century, genuinely excellent. It was a failure of the assumption that the threat environment outside the facility remained static, because Soundwave did not work like a human intelligence operative. He did not find vulnerabilities in encryption architecture or exploit communication protocol weaknesses. He listened at a bandwidth range that human technology did not monitor, across a frequency spectrum that the SGC's security systems had no instruments to detect, with a sensitivity that could resolve a whispered conversation through 3 meters of reinforced concrete. The compressed transmission from Carter's workstation to Ratchet's internal database passed through the SGC's internal network, and the internal network, unlike the external communications infrastructure, was not shielded against the sensor suite that had been purpose-built for exactly this kind of passive interception. Soundwave had the formula 12 minutes after Carter finished writing it. Megatron's response, when Soundwave delivered the intelligence, was a silence of the specific type that his officers had learned to read as a recalibration. Not anger, not satisfaction, but the quiet of a strategic mind absorbing a new variable and restructuring its model accordingly. The formula changed things. Not in the way that Anubis's research program had threatened to change things. That was an existential risk, a threat to the fundamental nature of Cybertronian existence. But in the operational sense, the immediate tactical sense. With a reliable energon supply chain running off the Milky Way's abundant Naquadah deposits, the Decepticons were no longer guests in this galaxy. They were residents. Shockwave, he said. Shockwave had been running conversion calculations before Megatron finished saying his name. The facility they chose was on P3X403. A world the Goa'uld had partially industrialized before abandoning it during a system-lord territorial dispute, leaving behind a functional Naquadah processing infrastructure with no active garrison and no orbital defense net. Shockwave's assessment was that full conversion capability could be operational within 72 hours. Megatron approved the timeline and turned his attention to the second implication of the formula's acquisition. The SGC now knew it had been compromised. O'Neill's reaction to the security breach was, by his own standards, restrained. "Someone walked out of this building with Sam's formula," he said, standing in Hammond's office with Carter and Tilk, his voice carrying the particular flatness that meant he was managing an anger that he decided expressing loudly would not be productive. "Through our encrypted internal network. Which means whatever got it isn't using our frequency ranges, isn't tripping our security systems, and has been inside our monitoring perimeter long enough to know the transmission was happening." "Soundwave," Ratchet said from the corridor outside. The Autobots had not been cleared for Hammond's office, a protocol that Hammond maintained not from distrust but from the structural reality that his office was not rated for occupants of Ratchet's mass. "His alt mode is a communications and surveillance platform. Passive interception across ranges your technology doesn't currently instrument. I should have flagged him as a specific security risk during the initial threat assessment." A pause that carried the weight of professional self-criticism. "I did not. That is my error. Can we block him?" Carter asked. "Not with your current infrastructure," Ratchet said. "His passive range exceeds anything your shielding can cover without a complete Faraday reconstruction of this facility. What you can do is feed him incorrect information. Transmit a corrupted version of the formula, close enough to register as authentic to a passive intercept, different enough to produce non-functional conversion results. It won't stop him indefinitely, but it degrades the value of whatever he's already taken." "How long to build the corrupted version?" Hammond asked. "I already have it," Carter said. Hammond looked at her. "I built it 2 days ago," she said, with the composure of someone who had been operating on the assumption that the facility was being passively monitored since Soundwave's capabilities had been fully characterized, and had simply not announced this assumption because announcing security countermeasures to a room that might itself be monitored was counterproductive. "When Ratchet finished Soundwave's capability assessment, I built a corrupted formula variant, and stored it alongside the real one with identical metadata. If he intercepted the transmission, there's a 40% chance he took the corrupted version. And a 60% chance he took the real one," O'Neill said. "Yes," Carter said. "So Megatron may or may not have a working formula." "Yes." O'Neill looked at Hammond. Hammond looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man doing probability calculations and finding none of them comfortable. Tilk said nothing, which was not indifference but the focused attention of a warrior who had already moved past the diagnosis to the operational response. "P3X403, Tilk said. "Shockwave has been observed transiting to that world twice in the last 18 hours. The abandoned Goa'uld processing infrastructure there is consistent with a conversion facility installation. You've been tracking him," O'Neill said. "I track all of them," Tilk said, with the serenity of someone stating an obvious professional standard. Hammond straightened in his chair. "Options. We hit P3X403 before the facility becomes operational," O'Neill said. "Same approach as Anubis. Fast insertion, targeted destruction, extraction before the orbital response arrives." He paused. "Except this time Megatron knows we're coming. Soundwave has been in our communications for an unknown period, and Shockwave is on site. Shockwave is the most dangerous Decepticon combatant after Megatron," Ratchet said from the corridor. "His weapon systems are experimentally enhanced beyond standard Decepticon configuration. In a direct engagement he is." A pause with the clinical quality of an honest assessment delivered without softening. "Difficult. Ironhide's definition of difficult and your definition of difficult are different," O'Neill said. In this case, Ratchet said, they are the same definition. Hammond looked at his team. We move in 12 hours. I want Optimus Prime in this briefing. The attack on Cheyenne Mountain began at 0347 hours. It began not with the dramatic announcement that gold assaults typically favored, the orbital bombardment, the Hotak descent, the theatrical deployment of Jaffa armies in formation, but with silence, which was more frightening. The mountain's external sensor array registered the first anomaly at 0341, a localized subspace compression event 6 kilometers northeast of the facility, lasting 0. 4 seconds, producing no visual signature, and no electromagnetic emission in any range the array was designed to monitor. 6 minutes later, a second event, 2 kilometers closer. Then a third. The events were consistent, in Sergeant Harriman's subsequent analysis, with Asgard beaming technology operating at a modified frequency. Except the Asgard were not involved, and what was actually happening was that Soundwave had spent 3 weeks analyzing Asgard transporter signatures from intercepted SGC communications, and Shockwave had spent 3 weeks building a functional approximation from components sourced across 6 gold industrial worlds. The result was a Decepticon insertion capability that bypassed every physical security layer the SGC possessed. Megatron materialized in the gate room at 0347 with Soundwave, 4 Decepticon assault units, and 200 Cull warriors transported simultaneously via a modified Hotak ring platform positioned in a low-orbit insertion track that the mountain's radar coverage had a 17-second blind spot on every 40 minutes due to terrain masking from the Rocky Mountain profile. The 17-second window was not an accident. Soundwave had found it in SGC radar logs 14 days earlier. Harriman hit the alarm before the ring platform finished cycling. The iris slammed shut across the gate. The auto-defense systems engaged. And Megatron stood in the SGC gate room, the room that represented Earth's single most strategically critical military asset, the room through which every gate mission launched and every crisis response flowed, and looked at the iris, at the blast doors dropping across the exits, at the emergency lighting strobing red across the concrete walls, and said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Soundwave. The gate." Soundwave moved to the dialing computer with the efficiency of a system that had already mapped the SGC's gate control architecture from 3 weeks of passive monitoring and needed approximately 8 seconds to override the lockout protocols and begin dialing an address of his choosing. The address he dialed was the Beta site, the SGC's primary off-world evacuation destination, whose coordinates were classified above top secret and were stored in an encrypted partition of the dialing computer that was, in theory, inaccessible without a 7-stage authentication sequence. Soundwave bypassed the authentication in 11 seconds. 2 floors above the gate room, in the corridor outside the operations center, O'Neill was moving. He had been in the facility. A late operational debrief that had run past midnight and turned into a planning session for the P3X403 strike, when the alarm hit, and the 8 seconds between alarm and his first radio call had been enough to establish that the breach was internal, gate room level, and not a drill. The radio network had given him the next layer. Megatron, Soundwave, unknown number of Cull warriors, gate room compromised, blast doors holding on levels 2 through 4, not holding on level 1 because something had cut through the door mechanism with a precision that suggested foreknowledge of the door's construction. He had Carter on his left, Tilk on his right, and Daniel somewhere behind him doing something with his radio that O'Neill had stopped questioning years ago because it always turned out to be useful. "Optimus," he said into the communicator. "Gate room is Megatron's. He's dialing out." The response came back immediately. "I know. Ironhide and Bumblebee are on the surface approach. There is something you need to understand before we breach. Talk fast." "The ancient signal in my chassis," Optimus Prime said. "Daniel's analysis identified it as a recall beacon, a mechanism the ancients built into the original Primus Machina architecture. A failsafe. If Megatron accesses the gate network from inside this facility, the beacon activates. It will transmit the full Cybertronian biological framework, the complete spark replication sequence, across every gate address in the network simultaneously. O'Neill stopped moving for exactly 1 second. To who? To the ancient database nodes. Every outpost, every repository, every storage system they left behind. Which means to anyone who subsequently accesses those systems. A pause. Anubis has been trying to capture an Autobot because he needs a live spark to find the sequence manually. If Megatron activates my beacon, Anubis receives it automatically. Every ancient database in the galaxy receives it. Can we stop the beacon? Yes, Optimus Prime said. By stopping Megatron before he completes the dial. O'Neill was moving again. How long do we have? Soundwave is efficient, Optimus Prime said. 30 seconds. Perhaps less. The blast door between the level 2 corridor and the gate room stairwell had been cut through, precisely, cleanly, the edges of the cut showing the specific thermal signature of Shockwave's arm cannon operating at surgical rather than maximum power. O'Neill went through the gap without slowing, Carter behind him, Tilk stepping through with his staff weapon already at firing position, and the gate room opened up below them on the mezzanine level in a tableau that the training manuals did not cover. Megatron stood at the center of the room. The gate was active, 7 chevrons locked, the event horizon established, the blue shimmer of the wormhole filling the room with its cold light behind the closed iris. Soundwave was at the dialing computer completing the 8th chevron lock. The co-warriors were distributed across every exit point. And Optimus Prime was already in the room. He had come through the vehicle bay entrance, the same route used for his initial entry. And the blast doors that were supposed to seal it had not sealed it because Ironhide had removed them from the outside with the focused application of force that rendered the question of whether the doors could be locked academically irrelevant. Optimus Prime stood between Megatron and the dialing computer, and the gate room, which was large by any human architectural standard, suddenly felt very small. Don't, Optimus Prime said. Megatron looked at him with the expression of a being encountering an opponent he respected in the precise circumstance he had hoped to avoid. You know what the beacon carries? Yes. Then you know that stopping me means this galaxy never gets the spark sequence. Anubis never builds his army. The Decepticons never have a resupply chain that doesn't depend on gold cooperation. A pause. I'm offering this galaxy a war it can survive. Anubis will give it one it cannot. You're offering it a war it survives on your terms, Optimus Prime said. Was Cybertron's most fundamental secret in Decepticon hands? Better Decepticon hands than a half-ascended parasite's. O'Neill had his P90 up and was doing the math that every soldier does in the moment before a trigger pull, range, angle, target vulnerability, downstream consequences. And arriving at the conclusion that his P90 was not going to be the deciding factor in what happened between 2 9-meter mechanical beings in the next 10 seconds, but that there was one thing in this room that might be. Carter, he said quietly. Carter was already at the secondary console, the manual iris control, the one that existed precisely because the primary could be overridden. She had understood what he meant before he said it. The iris opened. Not because anyone was going through it. Because an open iris meant an active wormhole with no physical barrier, and an active wormhole with no physical barrier was drawing 40,000 volts of event horizon energy into the gate room continuously, and Ratchet had told them, in the capability assessment briefing, 3 weeks ago, in the clinical tone of a medic cataloging known vulnerabilities. That sustained exposure to event horizon energy at close range interfered with Cybertronian transporter systems, communications arrays, and precision targeting. Soundwave's hands came off the dialing computer. The 8th chevron, half-locked, released. Megatron turned toward the gate, toward the open event horizon, toward the suddenly destabilized communication architecture that was preventing Soundwave from completing the lock. And in the half-second that the turn took, Optimus Prime crossed the distance between them. What followed was not elegant. It was not the carefully managed engagements the Autobot leader preferred, the minimum force, the targeted response, the preservation of options. It was two beings of equal mass and comparable strength hitting each other in a room that was not designed for either of them, at a force level that cracked the gate room's reinforced concrete floor in a pattern that the SGC's structural engineers would subsequently describe as total replacement territory. Cull warriors scattered. O'Neill and his team went flat against the mezzanine railing. The event horizon's blue light strobed with each impact. Tilt put 3 staff weapon blasts into Soundwave's torso at point-blank range. Soundwave went down. Megatron and Optimus Prime hit the gate structure simultaneously, and the chevron housing cracked along its full circumference, the gate tilting 6 degrees off vertical before the base anchors held. The event horizon destabilized and collapsed. The wormhole disengaged. The gate room went dark except for emergency lighting and the slow-fading glow of Megatron's optics as Optimus Prime held him against the gate structure with a force that was not quite sufficient to finish it but was entirely sufficient to stop it. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Ironhide came through the vehicle bay entrance with Bumblebee behind him, and the Cull warriors made the tactical assessment that their operational window had closed, and O'Neill stood up from behind the mezzanine railing and looked at the gate room. Cracked floor, damaged chevron housing, Soundwave down, Megatron held, and said, with the composure of a man who had learned that the universe always had one more thing. "Somebody call Hammond." 3 weeks after the siege of Cheyenne Mountain, the gate room smelled like fresh concrete. The repairs had taken 11 days. SGC contractors working in rotating shifts under cover of a maintenance closure that Hammond had explained to the Pentagon as scheduled structural reinforcement, which was technically accurate in the sense that reinforcing a structure after it had been partially destroyed by 2 warring mechanical giants qualified as structural reinforcement if you were committed to the framing. The new gate housing was rated to a higher tolerance than the original. The iris mechanism had been rebuilt with a manual backup to the manual backup. Harriman had a new console. He had requested it with the particular quiet dignity of a man who did not complain about his working conditions but had opinions about them, and Hammond had approved it without discussion because some things were simply right. Megatron was in a containment facility on a planet whose coordinates existed in exactly 4 SGC personnel's memories and nowhere else. No written record, no digital file, no gate log entry. The facility had been designed in 72 hours by Carter and Shockwave, which was an unlikely collaboration that had produced an unexpectedly functional result, because Shockwave had no investment in Megatron's comfort or eventual freedom and brought to the engineering problem the same focused precision he brought to everything, and Carter had no interest in building something that didn't work. The containment wasn't permanent. Hammond knew it wasn't permanent. Megatron knew it wasn't permanent. The value of it was the window it created, time to establish a new operational reality before the most dangerous Decepticon in the galaxy had the opportunity to reassess. Starscream had disappeared. This was, by consensus, worse than knowing where he was. He had last been tracked to a gate address in the outer rim of Goa'uld-controlled space, and the intelligence assessments that the Takare had shared, with a warmth toward the SGC that was marginally improved by the P7X554 depot destruction, which had set Anubis's campaign timeline back by an estimated 4 months. Suggested he was moving through the network with the specific pattern of someone building independent resources rather than seeking alliance. O'Neill had described this as a problem we're going to be dealing with for years, which was accurate and also understated, and Hammond had added it to the list of ongoing concerns that constituted the normal operational background of running Earth's primary defense against the universe. Anubis had withdrawn. Not retreated. Withdrawn, which was different, carrying the implication of a strategic repositioning rather than a defeat. The P7X554 strike had cost him 4 months of campaign timeline and significant material resources. The failed Bumblebee acquisition had cost him the Spark replication sequence. The Decepticon military arrangement had cost him Megatron, who was now unavailable, and the trust of the remaining Decepticons, who had received Soundwave's last transmitted intelligence, including the record of Anubis's second condition, the spark acquisition request, and had drawn their own conclusions about what the half-ascended system lord had intended for their kind. Anubis was patient. He would rebuild, replan, and return. But for now, he was elsewhere, and elsewhere was worth something. The Autobots were staying. This had been the subject of 3 separate briefings with Hammond, 2 with the Pentagon, 1 with the Joint IOA committee that had lasted 6 hours and resolved nothing, and 1 private conversation between Hammond and Optimus Prime on the P3X774 Gate Plaza that had lasted 40 minutes and resolved everything that mattered. The Autobots had no way home. The vessel that had carried them here was destroyed, the gate network didn't reach Cybertron, and the ancient recall signal that had brought them was a one-way mechanism with no return architecture. They were in the Milky Way. They had demonstrated, across 3 weeks of the most operationally complex crisis the SGC had managed since the Replicator incursion of '99, that they were trustworthy, effective, and genuinely committed to the protection of life in terms that aligned more closely with the SGC's mission than any alien ally the program had previously developed. Hammond had authorized permanent alliance status with the quiet efficiency of a commander who knew when the analysis was complete. Daniel's research had been classified at the highest level the SGC possessed, above top secret, above cosmic, in a category that Hammond had created specifically for it, because the information that the ancients had seeded Cybertronian life 12 million years ago was not intelligence that could be safely held in any existing classification framework. The implications reached too far. Into gold theology, which was built on the false premise that the ancients' legacy belonged to them. Into Asgard history, which intersected with ancient history at enough points that Thor had asked, in his characteristically direct way, to be briefed when the research was complete. Into the question of what else the ancients had seeded, what other civilizations and what other galaxies carried their foundational architecture in dormant form, waiting for a recall signal that might never come or might already be transmitting on a frequency no one had thought to monitor. Optimus Prime had read Daniel's full research document in a single session, alone in the modified lab, with the door closed. Daniel had given him the privacy without being asked. When Optimus Prime emerged, he had stood in the corridor for a long moment looking at the SGC around him, at the personnel moving through their routines, at the gate room visible through the blast door window, at the chevron housing still bearing the stress marks from where he had put Megatron through it, and said to Daniel, who was waiting with the patience of someone who understood that some truths needed time. "We always believed we arose from Cybertron itself. That the planet made us. Maybe it did," Daniel said. "The ancients gave you the foundation. What you built on it, 12 million years of civilization, culture, war, choice, that was yours." Optimus Prime had considered this for a long time. "Does it change what we are?" "No more than knowing your parents changes who you become," Daniel said. O'Neill, passing in the corridor with a coffee mug and the expression of a man who had heard enough philosophy for 1 week, said, "For what it's worth, the robots saved our planet. That's in the report. The rest is above my pay grade." He kept walking. "Good talk." Tilk, behind him, paused. Looked at Optimus Prime with the steady regard of a warrior assessing a peer. Said with the economy that carried more weight than elaboration, "Indeed." Bumblebee made a sound, a short, ascending whistle that Ratchet had long ago stopped translating in official context because some things communicated better without words. And somewhere in the gate room, Harriman looked up from his new console and for the first time in 3 weeks smiled. The Stargate stood in its housing, repaired, waiting. It had connected 2 galaxies' worth of trouble, ancient secrets, and living machines to a mountain in Colorado, and the mountain had held. Beyond it, the network reached to thousands of worlds, each carrying its own version of the same story, life, in whatever form the ancients had imagined or set in motion or simply left behind, finding its way forward through the dark between the stars. General Hammond signed the Alliance authorization at 1,400 hours on a Tuesday. O'Neill's report described it as routine. The Stargate had seen impossible things. It had seen gods exposed as parasites, heroes ascend to higher planes, and civilizations liberated from 10,000-year slavery by a team of 4 people who refused to accept that the odds were the final word. It had seen replicators and Orion, the cold mathematics of survival calculated in gate addresses and C4, and the specific courage of people who stepped through a shimmering event horizon knowing that what waited on the other side might kill them, and went anyway, because someone had to. It had not seen this before. Living machines from a world the ancients had seeded before Earth's first complex organisms drew breath. A war 12 million years in the making, delivered through a ring of ancient metal in a mountain in Colorado. An alliance forged not in diplomatic chambers but in cracked concrete, an event horizon light, and the shared understanding that some threats were too large for any one species to face alone. The Decepticons were scattered. Anubis was regrouping. Starscream was somewhere in the network, building towards something that would require its own reckoning. The galaxy remained exactly as dangerous as it had always been. But the Autobots were here. Standing in the SGC? Carrying the ancients' oldest experiment in their chests, still burning after 12 million years. In the mission files, under Alliance designations, Hammond wrote 3 words: Autobots. Trustworthy. Essential. O'Neill added 1 word in the margin. Indeed. Indeed. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.